This is CBC Nova Scotia News.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. This evening, we're doing something a little different on the program. We're hosting a public forum on the legalization of marijuana. I'm here in a studio adjacent to our normal news studio. We'll get there in just a few moments for the headlines and the news from Amy Smith. But tonight, we have assembled a panel of experts to take your questions. Have a look over here for esteemed people who have plenty of expertise when it comes to the issue of marijuana in this country and the legalization of it. And we'll be talking to them a little later. Of course, we are here because the federal government has committed to legalizing marijuana by July 1st of 2018. And right now, provincial governments right across this country are more or less scrambling to get the framework in place to be able to be ready for that day. Now, some provinces are farther ahead than others. In fact, today in New Brunswick, that province announced new strict guidelines for the recreational use of cannabis, including a limit to how much pot you can carry with you, and also a no smoking in public rule for marijuana. So those are some of the things that provinces are working on. It's not that Nova Scotia is a little farther behind on some of these preparations, but lots of work is being done in the background. And so there are lots of questions about how all of this will unfold, and that's where you come in. We want you to get your questions to us. With us in the studio audience, there is a small group of people who will have some questions of their own, but we're asking the public who are watching us online and on television to be able to join us as well with some questions. And you can do that by using or contacting us on Facebook and on Twitter. You can simply search for CBC Nova Scotia or by email at cbcns@cbc.ca. Send us your questions and we will get them to the panelists as quickly as we can. Don Connolly will be joining me in just a few moments, but right now let's send you over to Amy and today's news stories. Amy.
All right, Tom, we'll catch up with you a little later in the show.
Okay.
And let's get to tonight's top story. Two members of the Halifax Regional Police Force are facing charges tonight. The pair are special constables, booking officers in the cells at police headquarters. They've been charged with criminal negligence causing death, and the charges stem from the death of 41-year-old Corey Rogers in a police cell. Blair Rhodes is live in the newsroom with the details. So Blair, what can you tell us?
Well, Amy, Corey Rogers was arrested late on the evening of June 15th, 2016. He was at the IWK Children's Hospital. Rogers' arrest came just hours after the birth of a baby daughter who's growing up without a father. Rogers was found unresponsive in a cell. Paramedics were called, but he couldn't be revived. The province's Serious Incident Response Team, or CERT, was called in to investigate. To make sure there was no appearance of conflict, CERT consulted with prosecutors in Manitoba before laying the criminal negligence charges. The case returns to court in the new year.
All right, Blair, Corey Rogers' mother, Jeanette, has spoken to us about her son's case in the past. What is she saying today?
Well, I spoke with her this afternoon after the charges. She's been expecting them for some time. She says she wishes the three officers who arrested her son were also charged. Jeanette Rogers says she's proposed restorative justice to police to settle her son's case. She wants them to change policies to ensure nobody else will die like her son did. Rogers says she hasn't gotten a response from police, and they say because the matter is now before the courts, they won't be commenting. Amy?
All right, thank you for that, Blair. That's Blair Rhodes with tonight's top story. About a third of the workforce at the Donkin coal mine was laid off today. At a meeting at the mine this morning, 49 of 130 employees were told they are out of a job. The layoffs are effective immediately and they are permanent. The mine's owner, Cameron Cole, says it needs to make changes to make the operation more economically viable.
We need the time and space to revise the mine plan, to switch out the equipment that we have right now, and to create and to go through the approval process to create an economically viable operation. And right now we needed the economic space and time to do that.
Most of the people who lost their jobs today are Cape Bretoners who took work at the mine so they could be closer to home. And now some of them are considering going back out west to find work. Gary Mansfield has that side of the story.
A steady stream of traffic flowed from the Donkin mine today after 49 workers received pink slips.
It was unexpected. Nobody really knew what was going on, and we kind of thought there was going to be some pay cuts and stuff, but we got termination of the job.
It's the third month on the job for Mitch Tracy. He's just one of 46 Cape Bretoners who got laid off. He says working at Donkin kept him close to his home in Glace Bay. He expects many of those who lost their jobs will be going back to Alberta.
A lot of people turned down jobs out west and everything to work here, to stay home, and that was it. We didn't expect any of this anyway.
Well, I think it's a pile of crap.
Theo Musial is a licensed electrician and a retired DEFCO miner with 30 years of experience. He says he's not buying the company's reasons. He believes they're trying to weed out certain people.
I guess we're not productive because we're the guys they got rid of. I think they want to get rid of some people that they don't want.
But for some, there's still hope at Donkin. The company says people who were terminated will have an opportunity to apply for other jobs in the future.
They're going to expand again eventually, so the only people that they have really trained to operate right now is the people that they're letting go. So, I mean, there's always a chance for us to get back, so hopefully that's the case.
Gary Mansfield, CBC News, Donkin.
The local MLA says this is a difficult day for the 49 employees laid off this morning. But Chuck McClellan also says he's confident Cameron Cole will keep the mine going. He says the firm has invested too much to give up.
I do believe this isn't a sign of worse things to come. This is just a temporary bump in the road, but it's a tough bump for sure. And I'm just going to try to be as reassuring as I can and help with what I can do on the government side to make sure that we build the employee base and the human resources at Donkin when the time is right.
McClellan says the government will not cut corners to have the mine's new plan approved. He says the company has not asked for money from the province. A family doctor who retired in Halifax this year says he's not surprised that young doctors don't want to take on private practice. When Dr. Graham Bethune opened up shop nearly 40 years ago, that was his only option. But now those who choose family medicine have ways of being employed without the cost of being an employer. Carolyn Ray is back tonight with this latest look at our doctor shortage. So Carolyn, what happened to Dr. Bethune's practice? Did someone replace him?
Well, Amy, no. In fact, Dr. Bethune gave a full year's notice, and in that time, he couldn't find anyone to take over the practice. So now most of his patients don't have a family physician. And Dr. Bethune says unless we change the way we fund private practices, he expects we'll hear more and more stories just like this.
Dr. Graham Bethune's examining table is considered vintage. Just check out the knit covers on the stirrups. But like his practice, Bethune hasn't been able to give his table away. His recruitment efforts resulted in just one meeting with a potential new hire, but he quickly learned why young doctors have no appetite for private practice when they can work in a hospital instead.
I had one young second-year family medicine resident say, I can go to work in another community outside Halifax as a hospitalist and make $1,300 a day. Why would I come to your clinic and maybe struggle to make $900 a day and then pay 25, 30, 40% in overhead on top of that and manage a business?
Dr. Bethune's name is no longer on the building. This notice was up for a year before he left. He did what he could to help the people he's treated for decades.
Patients would come to me and say, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Find me a doctor. Please help me, help me, help me. So I did, and I maybe got 500 or 600. I called my colleagues and said, would you take someone? And they did.
Well, he helped some. More than 1,000 of his patients are now without a doctor.
By nature, I think I'm an optimist, but I'm not optimistic at all now. I think it's disgraceful that every Nova Scotian does not have a family doctor. And it's getting worse.
So Carolyn, is Dr. Bethune offering any solutions on how to deal with this problem?
Well, Amy, he says in order to be competitive and lure in new doctors, we simply need to pay family physicians more, or he says the province could provide some of that support staff. So, for example, some clinics have family practice nurses, and he says if the province provided those positions instead of making the physicians pay for them out of pocket, that could go a long way in filling some of our vacancies. Amy.
All right, thanks for that, Carolyn. Carolyn Ray reporting for us tonight. Health Canada has lifted a number of restrictions today on the so-called abortion pill, which will create more access to the medication. Mifegymiso can now be prescribed up until 9 weeks into a pregnancy, as opposed to the previous 7 weeks. The department also announced doctors will no longer be required to take a course in order to prescribe it. Health Canada says the changes come after it rigorously reviewed new scientific evidence submitted by the drug maker.
I think the reality for this medication is that for years it has been over-regulated, and for years there have been confusing messages along in the product monograph and in supporting documents. And I'm just delighted that Health Canada has responded to the lobby by the medical community.
The abortion pill has been free in Nova Scotia since November 1st. The Chinese ambassador to Canada is in Nova Scotia today. This morning, he met with Premier Stephen McNeil and some members of his cabinet. McNeil says enthusiasm is growing for an idea he's been kicking around for the past couple of years, a direct flight from China to Halifax, even once a week. Well, today, he talked to the Chinese ambassador to Canada, Liu She, who says he will lobby for it back home.
Well, Premier McNeil mentioned to me he really wants to have a direct air from China to Halifax. And Ambassador said, I will very actively to promote and make it happen.
So talked about the need to continue to strengthen trade ties between the province and his homeland. He says most people associate it with one thing, lobster. Seafood exports alone to China are worth $255 million to Nova Scotia businesses. All right, it's time for a quick look at the weather now. And Kalen, you said it was going to cool down, and it sure did.
Absolutely. We can certainly feel that in the province this evening. Most temperatures are sitting already around the low to mid single digits, and low single digits, that's what we're looking at for low temperatures tonight for most areas in Nova Scotia, and even the possibility of a few locations seeing a couple of flurries both overnight and very early tomorrow morning. More on that in a moment. Of course, much cooler today because of those northerly winds that continue to blow across the province. As we take a look at things on radar, we're not seeing much yet, but I do want to point out in through the greens and blues back into the southwest of New Brunswick, that is an area of very light showers mixing with some flurries, and certainly possible that could move into locations like the Annapolis Valley and northern parts of Nova Scotia as we move through tonight into tomorrow morning. I don't think we're going to be seeing any accumulations out of the wet flurries, though. Well, let's take a look at our forecast model. So the greens and the blues showing up here, that's that mixture of very light showers, wet flurries I was talking about earlier. You'll notice that they do linger into the early morning hours of Wednesday, but after that, moving into Wednesday afternoon, temperatures warm up enough that we won't be seeing any more flurries fall. Instead, it'll be cloudy skies with the potential for some patchy drizzle. Lows for tonight, though, in most cases are going to be in the range of 1 to 5 degrees, so I can't completely rule out some lower elevations away from the coast being down near the freezing mark tonight. As far as high temperatures go for tomorrow, it's going to be another chilly day for the Annapolis Valley. Remember that chance of an early morning shower or flurry. Afternoon high temperatures will be near 6 degrees. For the south shore of the province, high temperatures tomorrow between 6 and 9 degrees. Cloudy skies, patchy drizzle in the forecast. Same thing goes for Halifax, Halifax County. High temperatures between 5 and 7. Northern parts of Nova Scotia, that chance of an early morning shower or flurry. Afterwards, cloudy skies and some patchy drizzle, especially near parts of the coast. And Cape Breton, a very similar forecast with high temperatures between 7 and 8 degrees. Cloudy skies and patchy drizzle possible throughout the day. Amy?
All right, thanks for that, Kalen. The baseball world is in mourning tonight. Former Toronto Blue Jays pitcher Roy Halladay has died. His single-engine plane crashed in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Florida. Authorities say there were no Mayday calls and that it was a 2-passenger plane, but they couldn't confirm if there were other passengers. The National Transportation Safety Board is investigating. Halladay spent 12 seasons with the Blue Jays and played for the Phillies as well. He won 2 Cy Young Awards for Best Pitcher. Halladay was 40 years old. New details obtained from the leaked Paradise Papers say Prince Charles invested millions in offshore companies. But one transaction is raising questions about a possible conflict of interest. The prince's private estate invested $100,000 in a company that promotes carbon offsets in 2007. During that time, Charles gave speeches promoting carbon offsets. A year later, the shares were sold and the estate made more than $200,000 in profit. There's no suggestion of any illegal activity, but critics are calling on the royal family to be more transparent about its investments. The Canada Revenue Agency is promising swift and appropriate action in the wake of the massive Paradise Papers leak, but it's not telling Canadians just how much money the government is losing to offshore schemes. That's because the CRA doesn't even track those figures. Dave Seglins has more on this glaring financial blind spot.
$6 billion, $10 billion, 15? Just how much money escapes the grasp of tax collectors each year, no one knows.
The Canada Revenue Agency is the most incompetent agency in the Government of Canada.
Senator Percy Down has been waging a 5-year fight, demanding the Canada Revenue Agency hand over data to show just how much money is lost each year to tax havens.
They do a terrible job on overseas tax evasion. Why is that? And why is the gap not being measured as a tool to assess how big the problem is?
The so-called tax gap is an estimation. It's a best guess. The difference between what winds up in public coffers and what's actually owed. Basically, the amount that authorities fail to collect each year.
Many countries estimate these losses. The U.S. tracks it. They lose about $689 billion each year. The European Union, $261 billion. Sweden, $24 billion. Canada, who knows? The Canada Revenue Agency holds all the records needed to calculate the tax gap, and they've objected to releasing data concerned about Canadians' privacy. The agency's also questioned whether it's worth the time and money to crunch all the numbers.
Well, other countries have managed to do so.
This former NDP MP says it's time Ottawa gets serious about offshore tax losses, which even conservative estimates put at about $6 billion a year.
That's a heck of a lot of money. That might, in fact, be enough money to repair our crumbling infrastructure.
We did some math too. $6 billion could fund 200,000 new childcare spaces, 4,600 affordable housing units, 1,000 new MRI machines, or 650 water treatment plants on reserves.
Since the Paradise Papers leaked 2 days ago, Canada Revenue has once again vowed to look more closely at offshore activity. But in terms of putting a hard number on the amount of tax lost each year to offshore havens, the government has said only it will study it. Dave Seglin, CBC News, Toronto.
All right, it is time for a quick break now. When we return, it is over to Tom Murphy and Don Connolly for a joint venture, a forum on the legalization of marijuana in Nova Scotia.
Good evening and welcome to this CBC News special forum on legalized marijuana in Nova Scotia. I'm Tom Murphy.
And I'm Don Connolly, and we're going to be looking at the big issues around legal marijuana, from how it's sold to how you can buy it and where it can be used.
Lots of ways to follow us along tonight. We're broadcasting live on CBC television and online at cbc.ca/ns, as well as on our YouTube channel and on Facebook. That's important to note because the television portion of this forum lasts until 7 p.m., but the forum will continue live online for another 40 minutes.
Now, we've put together a panel of guests to answer your questions. Todd Leader is a psychologist and mental health addictions consultant. Myrna Gillis is a lawyer. She's also the head of a company that aims to become the largest marijuana grower in the province.
Also with us are Nadine Wenzel. She runs a company that helps employers deal with drugs in the workplace. And Chris Enns owns a marijuana dispensary and educates people on how to grow their own marijuana. We were also expecting Nova Scotia Justice Minister Mark Fury, but after agreeing to participate, his office told us this morning he decided not to take part after all.
But we do have a live audience here in studio to listen and to participate throughout the course of the evening, giving us questions.
And of course, we also need questions from those of you watching online or on television. You can send them to us on Facebook or Twitter. Just search CBC Nova Scotia, or by email to cbcns@cbc.ca. We'll put some of your questions to the panel. So, how did we get here? Well, it's because the federal Liberals made legal marijuana a key part of their campaign platform in 2015.
The Liberal Party is committed to legalizing and regulating marijuana, controlling it in a way that is going to protect our kids and remove criminal elements from it. And we're going to get started on that right away.
But while legalizing marijuana is a federal matter, the details of making it all work are left to the provinces. This is what the proposed federal law lays out: a minimum age of 18, though provinces can make that higher. People can possess up to 30 grams of dried or fresh cannabis. Consumers can grow up to 4 plants at home. No edible products allowed, for now. New impaired driving laws setting an illegal level of drugs in your system. And while some provinces have asked for an extension, the Prime Minister is sticking to his schedule.
We're still looking at summer of 2018 as the time where the legalized framework will come into play right across the country.
So far, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Manitoba have released details about how they will sell and regulate marijuana sales. Nova Scotia's government asked for public input through an online survey, but hasn't yet announced its plans. So now let's get to your questions about marijuana legalization in this province. And our first question tonight comes to us from Irene Wilkinson, who writes, "There is evidence that marijuana is harmful to adolescents. Why are we legalizing marijuana?" And I wonder, Mr. Todd Leader, would you like to start off with that one?
Sure. Well, the evidence tells us that if we control the supply of a substance, then we're able to actually to regulate in a way that protects or that I guess keeps certain people from getting it. So if you go back to Prime Minister Trudeau's statement, he said we're going to legalize for the sake of keeping it out of the hands of children. Well, if we don't control the supply, then we have no means to do that whatsoever. And so legalization is the right thing to do because it gives us the mechanisms of doing that. But the trick is in the details, and if we don't regulate according to a public health model as opposed to a commercial model, then we fail at his key promise, which is to protect our youth.
Been lots of talk in recent months about the age at which you should be legally allowed to consume cannabis. What are your thoughts on that? There's been quite a debate over that.
Yeah, well, you know, if we look at it from a medical perspective, a physiological perspective, and a psychological perspective, adolescence is considered to end at about the age of 25. And so if we're really trying to protect adolescence, then we would go with 25. But all of the national organizations, medical organizations that have weighed in on this with position papers, I think they've recognized that 25 is not politically realistic. And so they've compromised really significantly by 4 years by saying it should be 21. But setting it at 18 and allowing the provinces to go higher, which of course they're not going to. They're going to go to 19 if alcohol is 19, and they're going to stay at 18 if alcohol is 18. And that's why they set it that way, no question. And but what that's doing is actually completely throwing away the promise to keep it out of the hands of our youth. because these are still adolescents.
Any other strong feelings on that in the panel here?
I think it's really important to appreciate that our own Senate in 2002 committed a committee very much to this topic. And after reviewing experts and the peer-reviewed literature available at the time, they recommended 16 as the age for legalization. And I think we have to look at individuals in that age group and ask, do they have the right to use cannabis prophylactically to avoid various medical conditions that we now understand cannabis to help with? A 2006 study from the University of Alberta demonstrated that stem cell differentiation in the brain happens with cannabis use. And so I think it's important to open up the table to those that can make informed choices and that have the right to do that.
But the CMA was very clear. Speaking of medical experts, their national organization said 25 based upon real medical research.
Well, certainly the Senate had an opportunity to hear from more organizations than just the CMA, perhaps organizations and research coming from other countries, and they formed their own opinions. So there's certainly a balance to be had.
Right?
Sorry?
14 years ago.
So, as you can see, some debate on that. Either of you have any opinion on age there at all?
Well, I mean, I think that if the objective is the protection of youth, then I think we have to say what's happening under the status quo. That's the first question you have to ask yourself. And we know under the status quo that youth are consuming cannabis, they consume alcohol, they consume a lot of intoxicants. And if this is a public safety sort of discussion and dialogue, I also think that you need to engage people when they're young enough to have these discussions and education opportunities. And so I think what this is an opportunity not just from a public health perspective, but from parents and everyone else to have dialogue in their own families about what responsible consumption looks like. And not having those discussions is actually why we have the status quo that we do have right now. And as far as what the age should be, I don't think that this is a panacea. I think that we allow 18-year-olds to die in service of this country right now. And so I think what the perspective is really to have the discussion about what is harmful and to educate people to make the best choices that they can with their cognitive capacities at those ages forward. And I think for practical purposes, it does alignment with whatever the drinking age is, in a province. There is at least some logic and cohesiveness with that plan.
All right, Ms. Funsell, before we move on, did you want to add on this at all?
Yes, I was just going to say that we do know that from 18 to 24-year-old population demographic, they have the highest incidence of substance abuse in general of any demographic. And so I think I would agree with what Todd and Myrna have been talking about.
All right, Don.
Yes, we have been encouraging our audience who are here with us live, if they had questions, to come forward with. And we'll tell you how, by the way, if you're listening to us online or watching us on Facebook, how you can continue to send in questions through the course of the forum. But first, Scarlett Young, you have a question.
My question, I guess, would be how are the police going to determine impairment in drivers who use cannabis medically for disabilities that may otherwise present as impairment?
Who wants to handle that one?
Let's kind of start with you, Todd. There.
Yeah, I can give you some thoughts on this. We need to take this strictly as a public safety issue, nothing else. That is what regulations around any kind of impairment while driving is about, which means we need to be setting limits that are at the lowest level possible. So with alcohol, for instance, we have tolerance. We have the same issues of tolerance that exist. And we set the limit at the lowest possible level so that a 15 or 16-year-old who just gets a license and doesn't have much tolerance to alcohol, we need to make sure that the level is low enough to prevent them from consuming very much. But somebody who's been drinking for 25 years very heavily, has high tolerance, might be able to drink a dozen beer and still not actually function in an impaired way. But we can't have a moving target in terms of blood alcohol level. We can't adapt that way. We still have to have something that is measurable and that's based on the lowest level, because this is only about public protection.
But isn't that a sizable challenge for law enforcement to try and figure out how you do measure it?
Absolutely. There are a couple of pieces of technology being tested by the RCMP right now, and they're saliva-based. And I'm not sure where that's going to go, but my guess is that they'll end up being tested in court at some point because of the length of time that the the substance stays in the system, and somebody's got to figure out really good ways to measure this, and I'm not sure we're there yet, but this is going to be a very significant public safety issue, and there will be fatalities as a result if we're not very fast in getting there.
Before we go back to some of the other questions we have from listeners and viewers and people on Facebook, and we have a very nice selection of them, I'd like to get a quick reaction. In the absence of Mr. Fleury, you obviously were not sitting with Mr. Fleury on an ongoing basis as the province attempted to come up with what the rules will be in Nova Scotia. But you have a business up and running. You have major investments in what could be a very large business. You are both involved. Do you have a sense of where we are in formulating what the rules will be in Nova Scotia on the 2nd of July next year? Myrna?
I don't think that we have a definitive sort of plan that's been set out. I mean, what we do know is that there was consultation with stakeholders, and there was a questionnaire, and the questionnaire that was online certainly seems to be leaning towards a public retail model for distribution, at least on the retail level. I'm not sure with online. And what we do know, at least from discussions from the rest of the country, is that, the dividing line seems to be that it could be government retail, east of Manitoba, and everything Manitoba west would be more storefront. We also get snippets, when the ministers are meeting and in their conferences that they talked about having an Atlantic Accord. And so if there's an Atlantic Accord, well, who's out in front of it? It would be New Brunswick. And so New Brunswick has gone with, with a retail model. They've already secured supply.
Basically, Liquor Commission.
Yeah, exactly. The Liquor Commission, and there may be some change in the future, but yes, selling it at government-run stores like the NSLC, but not necessarily in an NSLC, but the same type of model.
Basically that model. What do you understand?
Well, when I reached out to Mr. Dexter, our past premier, who's now working as a lobbyist for the firm Global Policy Affairs, specifically in a division of the group called Canna Connect, he informed me that he's more or less already been bought out by licensed producers in the province that have hired him to lobby the Nova Scotia government and to form relationships between those private sector or LP applicants and the Nova Scotia government. And as a result of that, we were made it very clear that there's absolutely no opportunity to have our voice at the table, that ship has sailed, and that what's going to happen has already been decided, and now it's just a matter of letting that roll out. The patients that are with me today and the plans that we are putting into place in the next few months, I think will make that maybe not such a smooth sailing, hopefully.
Is there going to be a difference, do you think, in the way medical marijuana and recreational marijuana will be sold? Could you be in business doing medical marijuana and somebody in the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission in Bedford or an adjacent shop?
I think it's important not to draw this black and white line between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. If marijuana is making you happy, if marijuana is making you hungry, if marijuana is making you sleepy, then these are all medically valuable things. And we need to stop breaking down this gray and white area so that medical patients who really do need access to cannabis can get it at the absolute lowest prices possible and without this segregation and treating them as a separate part of the population. Let's drop the prices for everyone and increase the quality for everyone.
You must be talking to a lot of work employers and employees about workplace safety issues and legalities around that. Do they have any idea of where they are in the scheme of things?
I think the employers in general have been obviously absent from any of the discussions. They've not been invited to participate in anything related to safety, has been solely under the domain of driving. And we, by default, we don't have any legislation that guides us in any way around drugs and alcohol currently, but by default, what's happened is we would adopt what has been in place for driving impairments, infractions, etc., infractions. But no, there's been no employer consultation, and as far as I'm aware, no employer involvement either.
One of my roles is I'm the president of the Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia, and I can tell you that we've not been consulted. And I'm the vice president of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. We've not been consulted. And I sit on the ministerial advisory panel for innovation in mental health and addictions, and we have not had any discussion about this. So I've got zero information about what's happening and where this government is going.
Okay, well, maybe the government is listening tonight. We're going to talk more about regulation and distribution throughout the evening, of course. But I want to get to another question from a member of our audience here. It kind of dovetails nicely with what we're talking about here. This one comes to us from Heather Lonas, who writes, why do people assume that legalization will bring a great detrimental change to our society? Are people, are you feeling, do you feel like there's going to be a great detrimental change to our society when you hear people out there talking about this?
No, I don't think so. I mean, right now, 7 million Canadians consume cannabis recreationally. We have hundreds of thousands of medical patients that consume cannabis. I think the expectation is that those numbers will increase with legalization, but we still deal with it today in the workplace. We still deal with it on the roads. We still deal with it in mental health clinics. We deal with it in our families. The benefits, the detriments, it's already there. And I think that all this has done is it's made people talk about it a bit more, but how the world interacts with those that consume cannabis and the reverse is really pretty much going to be the same. I think what will be different is just, I think some of the more public policy discussions will now be framed around cannabis, which have already had a lot of that dialogue around alcohol and other issues.
Ms. Wenzel, maybe I'll ask you, how will it change the workplace, do you think?
Well, employers are uncertain and concerned, and I think, in conjunction with what Myrna's saying, what this has done is started that dialogue and getting them thinking about, well, there's a concern that use may increase. The perception is that legalization equals safety, equals indiscriminate use. And so that's the angle that I'm getting from the employers that I work with. So I think it's really important that they have a thoughtful process as to how they want to deal with any type of medication in the workplace that can be a safety issue. And so from my perspective, this is a good thing because it's starting that dialogue, it's getting people thinking about what are the best options to put in place and how to treat it appropriately, respecting individuals' rights and privacy and dignity, and also balancing that with health and safety in the workplace, with their due diligence to provide a safe workplace.
If you had a single piece of advice to offer an employer who's looking at July 1st of next year and wondering how it's going to impact the workplace, what would you say?
I'd say make yourself aware, educate yourself, and the most important thing is to have a policy, have something in place. We know that 80% of employers right now don't have anything addressing substance abuse, a policy of any sort. So create one, consult with other employers in your sector. You may be able to share some best practices already, or look at what you've got and see if it's addressing what you need it to. Specifically, how do you handle people taking medications that can affect their safety? That's a key piece that needs to be there. And the other piece that's just a best practice all around is making sure that people show up and they know they're expected to show up fit for work and remain fit for work. So that would mean not impaired using any substance, alcohol, cannabis, prescription medication, and what that means. So to have those discussions with your employees, so there's no guesswork, there's no perception of maybe there's a witch hunt to really identify people who are cannabis users. That's been a concern from a number of individuals. It's really important to be consistent across the board with that and not single out cannabis.
Very good. Thank you for that. Mr. Leader, you would like in there?
Yeah, I just want to kind of put a positive point out there. And employers, because of their anxiety over this and their uncertainty about this, they are actually becoming engaged in trying to learn. There's a conference next week in Halifax here. Actually, the Office of the Employer Advisor is holding a conference that is actually quite full at this point and is specifically dealing with this issue. And so the engagement is actually fairly high. But going back to your first question about should we expect this to become this enormous problem, I think that's not a question that applies very well to legalization or no legalization. It's a question that applies to regulation according to a public health model versus a commercial model. That's the distinction. And one will cause significant problems, one will cause a reduction in problems.
I'm going to give you a question which actually was supposed to be Mr. Fury, so I'm not sure how comfortable he or you would be handling one of his questions. But it came from two people, both Jean McIntyre and Karen McNaughton, both asked if there was a way to protect people from marijuana smoke coming from the neighbors. Now, many of your clients, would be smoking at home, clearly. What kind of advice do you say, okay, you may be taking this for chronic pain, you may be taking it several times a day, you're living next door to a young family.
Sure. So
what's good conduct there?
Whenever I hear of people having issues with smoke moving between apartments and there being annoyance of neighbors, a simple carbon scrubber, which is a bed of carbon attached to a fan that pulls all the air in the apartment through that carbon bed in a certain period of time. Usually a device like this costs around $200, would completely ameliorate any sense of cannabis smell coming from that room. And my confidence for sharing that information is that we even have grow rooms in apartments where we have hundreds of plants, and the carbon scrubbers in those apartments are able to completely destroy the smell such that neighbors on both sides have not known for a decade that there was a grow in that apartment. And so smoke is cleaned just as effectively as the smell of the plants itself.
I got the impression from Ms. McIntyre and Ms. McNaughton, they're more worried to put the beer bash in the backyard with the bongs added.
Well, I'm pretty confident that any sort of smoke dissipating into the outdoors air is not going to result in intoxication and secondhand consumption. I think it would be minimized to the extent pretty quickly.
All right, let's go to our in-studio audience again. Edward Doan is here. Edward, if you want to step up to the mic there, you have a question about trafficking.
Yeah, I was wondering what will constitute trafficking under the new laws? For instance, will passing a joint to someone else constitute trafficking?
Right, we don't have a police officer per se here, but we have someone with a law degree. Maybe you'd like to take that one, Myrna.
I'll do my best. I was in a disabilities, labor, and employment law. I wasn't a criminal lawyer, but I guess I'll. One of the things I think that we call it legalization is probably the wrong term. What we have is a regulated capacity to consume cannabis without consequence. That's what we have. So decriminalization has not occurred, and so there are many consequences in which there are still penalties for individuals that don't adhere to what that regulatory would be. And so what I do know is what the fines, they range from $200, which could be something as simple as over-consuming your limit as an adult, to 14 years if you sell to a minor, for example. So there are still consequences there. Do I think that passing there was discussion about sharing cannabis but really for the trafficking purposes I mean that is an example that is brought up and I've heard it already in white papers from the Canadian Bar Association. You have two university students, one that's over the age of majority and one that lives down the hall, and they're 17 or 18 years old and it's 19, and the person who's 17 doesn't have a consequence. You can up to 5 grams they can possess without consequence, but the person who passed it to them may. So I think that those are some of the things that came up from the Canadian Bar Association, that these are very concerning consequences that are actually more harsh than what's in place today. So I don't know, so the question would be that exact scenario of passing a joint, if it was to someone that was underage, has been brought up, and so as being a plausible, real concern.
So, your 17-year-old son or daughter is caught with the possession of marijuana or trafficking. What are the legal avenues? What way can this go? Might it be something like a fine? Is it a criminal offense? What happens?
Well, I think for the adult, yeah. So I think that the highest consequence is if you're selling to a minor. Mm-hmm. So that it's not what the minor is doing. I think that what's in place will still be there. And then I think after you hit the threshold, it may be the diversion program or the Young Offenders Act, but I mean one of the things that the intention was to not have youth have criminal records for possession. I mean, that was one of the ideas behind this. And so, I'm not sure if this addresses all of that. It addresses some of it and makes it better, but potentially an unintended consequence, for the example of the university students sharing or a sibling, for a younger sibling. If it was alcohol, it's a fine. Right, and there's not a consequence that incarcerates you in the same way. But right now, honestly, the fines go from 200 right up to 14 years, and that's depending on the range of your breach.
So this is similar in a way to the model you're describing is similar to what we have for tobacco in Nova Scotia, where it's technically not illegal, it is illegal for someone under 19 to possess it, but there's no consequence for them possessing it. They take it away, police take it away, but it is illegal for someone to provide it. It's not about selling even, it's about providing it to someone under 19. So this sounds like we're we're looking at a similar kind of model.
Well, they've the nicotine model. Yeah, and the same with the packaging and everything.
And it's a much better model than what we have for alcohol, because we're failing miserably at alcohol in terms of adolescents having access to it. So.
If you're following us on Facebook or online, we wanted to encourage you to communicate with us at cbcns@cbc.ca. We have received a question from Dwayne, and Dwayne wondered, when it becomes legal, and for example, if someone has a chronic illness like fibromyalgia and uses marijuana for pain, will the drug companies recognize this as a prescription drug? Chris, do you have any experience in that and what they're doing in other constituencies?
Yeah, I think it's already starting to happen. There was a student, I believe, from the University of Waterloo who was one of the first to really spearhead taking his personal insurance company, Sun Life, to court and getting the ability for compensation for a certain amount of his medicine per year. And it's now my understanding that Loblaws has opened up $1,500 per year for their employees for reimbursement of legitimately purchased cannabis under a medical license. And I think that's only going to spread to other insurance companies and employers as cannabis becomes more open in society.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think very quickly too that there's a couple of things. There's no drug identification number with cannabis, which is why conventionally it's not covered under insurance policies. And the Jonathan Zed case that you're referring to, he had an exception in the policy that said drugs or medication, and so it was able to open that up. Nova Scotia, we now have the Skinner case, which Mr. Skinner is having access. It's already before the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. So I think what will happen is that cannabis, the coverage is expanding, which is also, I think, very important why you have a separate medical regulation than you do rec, because if you combine them, you're really going to jeopardize access to coverage, medical coverage, and that's an important distinction to continue to maintain.
Nadine, this is kind of, I'm going to let you, this is sort of in your wheelhouse, professionally speaking.
Yes.
We'll let you back in on this.
Myrna's absolutely right with the DIN, but there are ways around that. Yeah. There are dummy DINs, and it certainly can be provided.
What's a dummy DIN?
A dummy DIN is a DIN. It used to be 6 numbers. I'm showing my age. Now it's 8 or more. But it's how the drug companies and how the insurance providers recognize what a particular drug is. It's like shorthand. And so it could, instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a particular drug, it could be 99999. So in other words, it's just an administrative piece of submitting a drug. And that's often perceived as a barrier. It's been identified as a barrier in the past, but it's really not. And I know it's something more and more employers are looking at, because insurers are bringing to the table options for them on that. And the health spending account is one that's actually been a novel and new approach to dealing with that as well.
Chris, you want to back in on that?
It's just interesting the talk of HST and how it's still being applied to medical cannabis patients who are prescribed this by their doctor. I think one of the reasons for the government wanting to really get on board legalization now is to apply a blanket HST to everyone and do away with the medical program, because decisions are starting to approach in the courts where patients are going to exert their right to not pay tax on something that's prescribed. There's no other prescribed medicine in Canada that we pay HST on. Why are sick patients that are specifically prescribed cannabis being treated specially with this special carve-out where they're being taxed?
And
that needs to end now.
That's coming. Those challenges are well underway on the HST, and again, you don't want an excise tax on medicine either. So, which you're going to have with rec. So that's a very significant consideration. And also, finally, just the cost benefit. People are coming off more expensive pharmaceuticals by taking cannabis. So if you're not motivated as an insurance company by the morality of someone needing this medicine, then you will be by the economics of it. And so that's where the increase is coming up, and that's where you're seeing the coverage.
And so continuing with that, though, the medical authorization piece is really important from an employer perspective, not only for coverage, but also for how it's addressed, because really there's 2 streams, medical authorization versus recreational use. And medical authorization warrants follow-up to make sure that what's being prescribed is not a safety risk for the individual. What's being authorized, it's not prescribed because it's not a patent medicine, so I make that distinction. But what's authorized, often what happens is when you investigate further, the physicians authorizing it don't all follow the same standard. So that's an option for an employer to explore in fairness, to determine whether or not they can support the payment and whether or not there's a medical accommodation that's required from that.
All right, lots of great questions coming in online. This one comes to us on Facebook from Christopher Lewis, who asks about medicine, actually, and Nadine, I may get you to answer this. He asks whether cannabis patients will be able to medicate when and where they need to. So should there be a distinction between where medical and recreational users can take it? When you think about the workplace, what do you say to that?
Well, the research right now is so in its infancy in a lot of ways. There are many combinations of THC and cannabidiol, CBD, some directly related, some inversely proportionally related, and of course, the concern around safety is related to the higher THCs because there's a greater potential for impairment with the higher concentrations. So from an employment perspective, employers have a right again and are really legitimately concerned. Again, I go back to the standardization. The College of Family Physicians of Canada in October of 2014 came out with a guideline document because Health Canada and no one else was providing any guidance to physicians authorizing it. And in there, there's some very specific requirements. And recognizing that even when it's authorized, the physician authorizing it should have an expertise in treating the illness for what it's being treated. And in addition to that, cannabis, or THC specifically, is only recognized and deemed to be appropriate at this point in time under the federal jurisdiction and under provincial regulatory bodies when all other options for particular treatment have been tried for a reasonable period of time and have failed. And then before cannabis is authorized, there's an expectation that the prescription cannabis that we have, Sativex, that's very similar in concentration for THC and CBD, be tried first before we go to cannabis. So there's a whole process in place for valid reasons because we don't have the science yet. And really, it's like picking a plant out of a field because we don't know yet what concentrations at what levels have what beneficial effect. We do know in general that THC is an analgesic. Can help with emesis, with nausea and vomiting. It's an antispastic, so it's very effective in people with spasticity secondary to multiple sclerosis and in neuropathic pain. And we know CBD has offsetting effects to the psychoactive component of THC, and it's very effective as an anti-inflammatory and to treat epilepsy. So there's some legitimate concerns and legitimate applications, but we don't have specifics yet. That's the problem.
So do you think early on, next July and just beyond that, do you think there's going to be some resistance of among employers when they say, when a worker comes to them and says, listen, I have a meeting with you, I have to talk about medicating. Are we going to be ready for that, do you think, by the time January and July rolls around?
People coming to employers, that's part of why it's important to have a policy in place and why there are conferences on the go and why there's a lot of discussion around this, because any individual taking any medication that can affect safety, they should feel safe coming forward to their employer. Safe in that they won't be discriminated against, be it cannabis, be it a narcotic or prescription narcotic, and that the employer will treat that fairly and that they will look at it from a medical perspective, determine whether or not the appropriate dose is being used from an occupational health assessment, and then from there, making a determination if an accommodation has to happen. So that's all under the authorization from a physician. Self-medication would not be handled well because there's no precedence, there's no guidance for employers, and really it's like pulling a feather out of a hat.
I think it's worth bringing you into this talk with the various groups that you work with. Do they feel that they are being made appraised of what the kinds of things that Nadine was talking about?
No, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of, no. But I was just thinking that one of the example you just used actually would be analogous to somebody choosing to use alcohol for their anxiety, self-medicating before going to work, right? Because if we don't have the right science behind it, and if it's not medically monitored, then really it's a shot in the dark, and that is a risk in terms of functionality at the job, and that's what the focus of employers needs to be.
Absolutely.
It is about whether or not you are competent to perform the duties safely and appropriately.
And the question would also be whether or not there would have to be some kind of matching up with other medications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, because we do know, I mean, it's like any prescription. We do know that there can be incompatibilities. And actually, we do know that with cannabis of any level, it can increase the concentration of certain drugs and decrease the concentration of others based on how they're metabolized. So there's, again, safety risks. So wanting to take away the potential stigma that's there and treating it exactly like it is. It's a medication. Is it appropriate? Are there options? Is this person safe in the workplace? And are they safe to work with the people they are working with, or do they need alternate accommodations?
And related to this issue, I mean, the question about this, or I guess, sorry, one of the benefits to legalization is that we now take this out of the dark and we allow the right kinds of drug trials to be done that are required of all other drug companies for all other medications being brought on the market. I mean, double-blind, randomized controlled trials. We have now the opportunity for people to come forward as subjects in true medical trials and determine cause and effect.
We're talking about stigma here. It's interesting. Sorry to interrupt there, Dan, but Don, we just got a question from CBCNS at cbc.ca, and the questions are coming in, and they're great ones, so thank you very much for that. But this sender asked for their name not to be identified, which is obviously a concern for some people out there. But the question is, what restrictions will there be on smoking in public places? We started the show tonight talking about how New Brunswick is saying no pot smoking in public places. I don't know what that means in New Brunswick. I'm curious what it might mean in Nova Scotia if we were to go that route here. Any sense of maybe if you want to start that off, Mr. Leader?
Well, my prediction, my crystal ball, which isn't always right, says that all the jurisdictions that currently have legislation that prohibits smoking in indoor public places will simply adapt that to include smoking of any substance. And that, I believe, is the right thing to do. From an ethical perspective, as a government organization, your job is to serve the entire public, and it doesn't impinge on somebody's right to use the substance, but it does restrict their right to have it affect other people.
But does it, if it's medical marijuana usage for spasticity, for example, what Nadine was mentioning?
Well, already any medical user of cannabis already has the right under Section 7 of their charter, their right to life, liberty, and security of the person to use cannabis wherever it's not causing a nuisance to others. And I add that nuisance as my own personal disclaimer, because obviously you don't want to be bothering anybody if you can avoid it. But sometimes you end up in a situation where some smoke might drift and it might cause some nuisance, but we're going to have to live with it. These are medically authorized patients using a medicine. But if we look at this as a much larger picture, there's a lot more to cannabis than just the smoke itself. There's community and a whole social aspect that forms around the use of cannabis and the sharing of cannabis. And if we want to say that businesses where people can come together and share cannabis, such as vapor lounges, are going to be outright banned in Nova Scotia, and if we're going to take it even a step further and say getting together with your friends at the park and sharing a joint is something that is both morally and lawfully inappropriate, I think we're moving in the wrong direction and back towards prohibition rather than ending this war on drugs.
We don't encourage people to drink alcohol in public parks. I mean, there are some rules in place for that kind of thing when it comes to alcohol. Is it not reasonable, do you think, for a government to look at similar restrictions when it comes to cannabis?
Well, all the medical literature around alcohol shows that this is a harm to our body. This is something that we want to look at as a social harm at the end of the day and discourage its use. Whereas the medical literature around cannabis shows that it works as an amazing prophylactic. That this is something we want to be encouraging the use of Canadians, especially when we look at the dose-dependent relationship between cancer rates and chronic cannabis use. And we see that those who are ongoing consumers of cannabis have lower rates of cancer than the general population. Absolutely, we want to lower the prices of cannabis in Canada, raise the price, and encourage as much consumption as possible, because not only will it lower our cost of health care in terms of treating cancer, it will relate to a society that no longer sees their government as the other and will bring us together.
Is that what you see in your crystal ball?
God, I hope not. No, I mean, the problem with this is that there are two issues that come to mind. One is that the statements you've made actually imply that there is no risk, that there is no harm. And this is not, as you said, this is not a benign substance. This is not a purely good substance. It does have harms. It does cause harms. Well, you know, the medical associations, you know, we've got a ton of literature on this that actually demonstrates the damage to the brain.
Once again, I would respectfully disagree that the medical literature demonstrates that, and I would ask you to provide studies, perhaps on the CBC forum afterwards, that we could continue that dialogue for the public.
Well, I'd prefer to take the word of the Canadian Medical Association, psychiatry, pediatricians,
we have to go to specific
etc.
studies and not individuals' opinions and individuals speaking of those studies. Let's get right down to the literature and share that with the public and engage in a public dialogue around those specific studies.
I think too, though, there is some just misinformation, and I think we need to clarify what that is. Patients do have a right to consume. This is not controversial. And patients also have a right to consume in public places. And even in Ontario, which is probably rolled out the most conservative model with respect to recreation, has still have provisions in public places, whether it's a hospital institution, whether it's extended care facilities, where there will be rooms that have proper ventilation, where people who require it medically can consume. I think where the challenge is, though, however, is that if people are in these places, it is difficult for law enforcement to distinguish between a medical patient and someone who is not. So that's a practical consideration, but there is. Sorry, go ahead.
I'd have to just pause right now. I want to talk more about those challenges in just a moment, but we do have to say goodbye to our television audience, which this does wrap up this first part of the forum on marijuana. Of course, there is lots to come, as we suggest here. If you're watching on television, our forum does continue now online. You can watch it at cbc.ca/NS and comment and send your questions. Thank you for joining us, and join us online. All right, thank you for continuing to watch online, and for those of you who are on television who have switched over, we continue this discussion. And Myrna, we did interrupt you there to make way for the television audience to leave, but you were talking about the challenge here when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, so all I'm saying is that I guess also one other thing about smoking, because I mean smoking I don't think most people advocate smoking. I mean but I think one of the things that will also happen for consumption that will make it easier is when edibles do come online, when we have oils and we have alternatives to vaping and smoking, then it will be less intrusive and less sort of maybe of concern to other people around them. But the other thing too so under the patient model, all I'm saying is there is a consumption, and there has to be accommodation so that people can have reasonable access to their medicine when they require it. On the recreational side, and I know Chris was talking about vape lounges, and I know that's also an area where I think we have to be thoughtful about this, because if you say that something is legal, but unless you own your own home and have that social economic sort of class that you own your own property that you can consume, if we don't have areas in which it's acceptable to people to congregate or to have access, we're going to be creating more of a public nuisance, quite frankly, because if there's not places that you can reasonably go. I don't know what that answer is, but I do think there has to be some consideration as to where people that can consume a product that doesn't own their own property, and that's the vast majority of people. So that's a consideration that we also have to be mindful of.
You touched, Chris, on something very early on in the first hour of the program about why there should be no distinction between medical and recreational marijuana use. So particularly, why do you see that as an important issue?
When I was in my 4th year of university and had the opportunity to review epidemiological data, so I appreciate that it's not causational, but they were looking at population groups in the US of 100,000 plus individuals, and they discovered that those who had consumed cannabis for 10 joint years or more had a statistically lower rate of head and neck tumors than those who were non-smokers in the population altogether. And this statistic was very alarming for me, because when you combine that with the data that shows how cannabis induces apoptosis or cell death in tumor cells, there's an understanding of how this would be caused if truly the epidemiological data is causational as well. And so my own work with cancer patients has been to try to encourage them to consume as much cannabis as possible in order to put the brakes on their tumor growth. And in many patients, I've seen those tumors reverse course. And if that's evidence for those who already have cancer, then clearly that's evidence for those who have yet to have a cancer diagnosis. Because from the day we're born...
Why is that significant between to differentiate between medical and...
We're all getting 1, 3, 5, and 10 cell tumors from the day we're born. Our body has an endocannabinoid system that acts to identify those tumors and resolve them, clear them out. It's one of many systems our body uses to take care of cancer. If that system isn't functioning as part of a whole, if we're not generating enough endocannabinoids, cannabinoids our body makes internally in order to identify those tumors and deal with them, then we can supplement that system with cannabinoids from outside the plant to restore our body's ability to fight those tumors. That, for me, is the most salient point around why there is no division between medical use and recreational use, because the moment you start consuming cannabis, whether you realize it or not, you are aiding your body in the prevention of cancer development.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mary, go.
Well,
you got your hand up first.
Yeah, so I think the distinction is there a difference between medical strains and non-medical strains, as opposed to should there be a separate system for the regulation of medical cannabis and non-medical cannabis? And I am very strongly of the view that they do need to be maintained separately. And the reason that they need to be maintained separately is individuals who access, well, a number of reasons. First of all, medical cannabis should be under the regulation and discussion with your physician. And you don't want people self-medicating, going in and deciding that I'm going to, just decide to do this medically. You don't want to take that sort of outside of that domain. For insurance, you don't want to take it outside that domain. For the tax issue that we talked about earlier, you don't want to take it outside that domain. For rights purposes, so that I can clearly delineate between you consuming under one regulatory regime versus another. It's very important also to incentivize research. You want to have these double-blind studies, guess what? They cost money. They're expensive. And you need to incentivize that. And the only way to incentivize that is to recognize that there is a different system in place for which we have to invest because we want to better the medicine. So yes, you could get collateral benefits by something that you might be taking recreationally, but you may not be as well. And finally, from a licensed producer perspective, you also want to incentivize the production of high CBD products, because you will not get that.
Tell people what CBD is as opposed to THC.
So CBD is the non-sort of euphoric version of one of the hundreds. There's many compounds in this plant, but it's one of it's one of the medical beneficial ones that won't get you high, and it won't. It's not going to impair you. And so we want to incentivize people to be growing those or having equal strains that are being grown, because this is very important. And if it's all rec and it's all sort of in one direction, then we disincentivize that production.
So on that point of production, just sorry to interrupt there just for a moment, who should grow it then? I mean, some people are talking with people who are already experts at growing pot now. Who think they should be able to continue to grow.
Lots of people are growing. I mean, you have medical patients have no limit on what they can grow as long as they have a script for it. So they can grow their own, and they can have a third party grow for it under the ACMPR. Under rec, you can have up to 4 plants that you can grow your own, and licensed producers. And the licensed producers, one of the things is that it is extremely rigorous in the sense of the manufacturing processes, the security processes, the testing processes, and certainly that's the supply chain that's being recommended at this point in time. And if people don't want to participate in that, they can grow their own. So that it's not like it's the only way to opt in.
Is the testing effective? Mr. Enns,
we had an interesting discussion about this before the program, and I made the point that when you're looking at a very large cannabis garden and you have the opportunity to be discriminate, you can pick a bud from a very specific area in the garden, and for that matter, from a very specific area on a plant. And as such, the cannabinoid percentages, the exact contaminants that may be present on that bud have been subjectively picked. And so I think it's not always as accurate, this testing, as we imagine or fantasize it to be. And above and beyond that, this testing of THC and CBD and the cost associated with that is a little bit more of a marketing illusion, because at the end of the day, there's dozens of other cannabinoids, and some of these cannabinoids, even though they're present in the plant in a lot lower weight, They bind to our body's cannabinoid receptors with a higher affinity, and the signal that they transduce into those cells is a lot stronger than THC and CBD. But we don't talk about any of these other cannabinoids, nor do we test them yet. It's really about marketing when we talk about THC and CBD, even though there's definitely unique benefits to the different profiles of the plants.
Which is why we need the research, which is why we need the clinical trials. But I want to go back to why it's really important to have the separate medical authorization versus recreational, because we know generally that the therapeutic effects of THC don't max out at around 9%. Recreationally, we know that the products that are available now can have up to 30% THC. That's the psychoactive substance, and that's what employers are struggling with, and that's why we need to have the separation of the two. If we have indiscriminate use of both, there's no way of knowing how someone is safe, and the testing that goes with that, not of the particular CBD and THC, but the testing of THC specifically and how that relates to impairment, going back to part of our discussion at the very beginning.
And, you know, this, on an intuitive level, this makes sense for consistency as well. If we're talking about this being a medicine, and I don't dispute that at all, actually. And I think we need to learn more about what it actually causes. But if we're treating it that way, then we need to make it consistent with the way we treat other medicines in terms of regulating and governing the testing, the production, the cause and effect demonstrations, the side effects, long-term effects. We need to regulate it as a separate issue. You know, a medicine is a medicine.
Okay.
It's interesting, sorry, Tom. It's interesting that if you go back, I think, to 1971 or 72, the Ledane Commission,
yes,
under Pierre Trudeau, father of, recommended the legalization of marijuana.
Decriminalization.
Sorry, yes, you're right, decriminalization. Yes. Yeah. But one of the things you hear consistently from scientists is we don't have the kind of scientific body of knowledge because cannabis has been criminalized and illegal, and therefore the research is very difficult, and many of the questions we struggle with between now and next July might well have been answered in 1968 if, in fact, it was more easy to deal with in a laboratory situation.
Yeah, so just taking from the Ledane, so before that, I mean, if you went back to 1923 when it became criminalized, and then...
I don't remember that.
No, I do, and this is my third life, and but you know, I think in 1937, so there were 200 medical uses of cannabis in the Pharmacopoeia. For the American Medical Association opposed in 1937 the criminalization of medical cannabis. And because it was called marijuana, a lot of people didn't even realize that cannabis was on the chopping block here, and we lost the opportunity. I don't think it's actually correct to say that there isn't medical documentation to support efficacy for cannabis. There are 24,000 publications and counting on cannabis efficacy, 12,000 of which say it's good for chronic pain. So we know the efficacy is there, and we've identified where it works. The challenge is that we have hundreds of strains, we have dosing, issues, but we have those same issues with regular pharmacological drugs as well. And you have to sort of, titrate or figure out what's right for somebody. So the challenges are similar. I think what I would say is it will only get better, I think, but the baseline is there. And so all of these studies, what it will do is it will give us greater degrees of predictability and repeatability, which can be challenging when you grow a plant, the consistency.
And one of the challenges is with patent medicines, we know the dose, you know how much is prescribed, and so you can make some relative predictability around side effects and adverse effects. With THC, CBD, whatever the combination is, we don't have that. We don't have anything that's labeled as a product other than the one prescription drug that's used as a spray, and it's got THC and CBD in it. And we know how much. We know how much is delivered by dose. With smoking or vaping or edibles or any of the other ways that people may consume it, we don't know.
But you can reconstitute it. All I'm saying is that you can take a percentage of THC from the whole plant, a percentage of CBD, and you can reconstitute. You can take terpenes, and you can take, so it's not that complicated. I think it's just that we need to have the degree of predictability.
One of the other issues around all of this that I think has to be stated explicitly, and no offense to my panel partners here, but is we have to recognize conflict of interest where, you know, in a commercial industry, right? And so when we're talking about what research we trust or what kinds of research we do or who should be overseeing that or governing that, we have to be really careful about that. We don't give Pfizer free rein to do what they want, and in fact, despite that, you know, all the drug companies have been found many times to manipulate research in order to increase profits, and no different really than the commercialized model of alcohol and tobacco. And so we have to be careful about conflict of interest. That when somebody's going to make more money by selling more of a product, then of course they will interpret and present research in a different way than someone who has no personal vested interest in it in terms of gain.
We have a question from on Facebook here. This is from Katie McDonald. She says, will or should the proceeds from legalization go to be used for education, infrastructure, let's say research as well, as in Colorado and Washington?
Not education. If we're talking about education for the sake of trying to create responsible use or prevent use, any of that, education does not work. And
why do you say that?
Because we've known this for decades.
When it comes to alcohol, you mean?
Alcohol, tobacco. It's the same. It's the same. Food, you know, healthy food, unhealthy food. We've tried education. Health education generally is an ineffective method at changing behavior or at preventing behavior or modifying behavior. So we continue to go to that, and we use terms like responsible use around alcohol. The people that created that term are the alcohol industry, because they know that responsible use is such a vague and abstract term that everybody sees themselves as fitting in that category. There's nobody who would say, well, I don't use responsibly. So that's why the alcohol industry uses terminology like that, right? And so we really have to be careful about that kind of issue of how we're actually what language we're using, and recognize that health education does not change behavior.
Nadine?
So I understand what you're saying, but respectfully, I know that when you do that with employees, with workers, the International Labour Organization back in 2003 did a multicultural, multinational study, North America, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, and they found that when you talk with employees about the adverse effects about substances in general that can cause them to be unsafe, their patterns of use change, and correspondingly, the number of incidents at work went down. So we do know that it helps. In that context, it makes a huge difference. And that's why I go back to it's so important for employers to educate themselves and to be communicative with all of their employees so they understand the associated risks.
That's a great point.
Not just cannabis, but any substance that can impair someone or make them unsafe.
Yeah, my point was more, you know, we tend to gravitate, whenever we come up with an issue like this, we tend to gravitate toward, you know, we need to educate our kids and, you know, to avoid or use responsibly. And there's simply no reason to do that. It's what I call it necessary but not sufficient. It's because it's something to educate them about, same as we educate them about sun safety, and we educate them about all kinds of other stuff that can be good or bad. But it's just education. That's only information. It's not a behavior-changing agent. But thanks, Nadine, for that also, specific context. Yeah. That's an important one.
But to back that up, it's also role modeling. So what happens with education in the workplace is that you are also demonstrating it by your actions that this is you know, the cause and this is the effect. And I don't think that there's, you know, when you look at educating youth, I mean, you know, they have to have a demonstration to back up the education about what does look, you know, more responsible or that doesn't as well. So I mean, I think there is some value to education, but you know, and I think that some resources should, you know, and the federal government's already said they're putting $36 million into their education.
A lot of that should be about educating them about educating the public about the substance generally and about the regulations, more so than education for the sake of.
The education should include all substances. Not just cannabis. I mean, if we're going to have the dialogue, let's have the dialogue. Yeah. And the real dialogue is about everything.
Absolutely.
And so, and so that people can make informed choices when they're comparing, you know, something that's designed to kill you, like nicotine, you know, versus something that may have some medicinal benefits for you. So, you know, any day of the week, you know, I think you need to have the full discussion if you're going to let people have informed choices.
Let's just not get to the point of thinking that education about the substance will cause any kind of preventative effect on kids' behaviors.
No, but that's why this is so important. It's driving employers to begin to put these things in place and have discussions with their employees about everything that can affect safety. So I think in that way, this is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris, do you expect that they're going to attempt to close you down by the middle of July next year at your dispensary?
They've tried to shut me down 4 times now. I've spent 3 weekends in jails over the past 3 years, and we're approaching a constitutional challenge finally after the end of all that coming this December, where we're arguing that the current medical regime is not constitutional because patients, those authorized by their doctor to use cannabis, do not have the ability to access cannabis at a storefront dispensary. They're forced to wait days by mail. They're forced to pay for whatever that mail order producer happens to have available at the time. And beyond that, the federal government has not followed through on a Supreme Court of Canada decision from 2 years ago, forcing them to mandate a system that provided access to both edibles and extracts to patients. The only thing beyond raw flower a patient can access today is an extremely diluted oil in order to maximize the revenue of the licensed producer selling it. Dispensaries continue to fill that gap for medical patients who have an authorization from their physician who need these products mandated by the Supreme Court of Canada. And beyond that, we had a decision in Allard which told the government to streamline the system for production of cannabis when patients wanted to grow their own. And the government has done nothing to ease that transition. In fact, it takes quite a bit of knowledge and assistance if you're not literate to fill out those forms and get them off to the government and then wait 5 or 6 months for the government to license you to grow your own cannabis. That's just ridiculous.
But will they stop next July if, in fact, like the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission / Cannabis office is blocked from you and they are open for business, will they not attempt to stop you?
Well, I'm still not going to be pessimistic and say that we're not going to sit at the table with the provincial government and we're not going to have the opportunity to onboard in this new system. And I found my conversations with Myrna wonderful before our meeting today. She's an LP applicant that's almost right at the edge of getting her license. They've got some great ideas for production. And I'm not against looking at a regulated supply that's been tested and offering that high quality to my patients if the variety is going to be there, and more specifically, if the price point is going to be there. My only concern with Aqualitas is that they're using a fish-based system that requires the death of the fish in order to get production where it's going to be.
They're alive.
But at the end of the day, those fish have to go somewhere.
No, they live out their life cycle. No, we don't. No, they live out their life cycle.
They never have to get eaten at the end?
No, they don't.
You know what? We might be in business at the end of this after all.
You learned something from this panel discussion. That's great.
No, they don't. We don't. No, they're good. It's vegan. It's a vegan created.
I misunderstood and I apologize.
No,
there you go.
Worries.
The fish live. All right, we're continuing to get great questions from online, and thank you for those. I'm trying to make a mention to our audience here. If any of you have a question, flag down one of our staff, and we'll help get you up to the microphone. But in the meantime, Dorothy Ann Brown emailed us this question. She's wondering, since there are bars that allow for communal consumption of alcohol, would it make sense to allow for the same for cannabis? And we touched on this briefly before, but what's wrong with the Cannabis Cafe? Some people find these to be controversial. Others were quite all right with them. Where does the panel sit on that?
Well, there's already bars where you can use cannabis and bars that have a back room where the cannabis users can go if they don't want to bother the rest of the bar. This has been going on for decades in Nova Scotia. We specifically created a lounge on 2320 Gottingen Street where anyone from the public can come in and use their cannabis as long as they're above the age of 18. And we only sell, obviously, to those who are medically authorized. We're very strict about that, but we want to create a community and an environment where people can learn about cannabis, where people can talk to other medical cannabis users and find out what's working for them, what might work for me. And beyond that, that dialogue often happens a lot easier when it's not with someone in an authority position, when it's not necessarily with a doctor or with even a bud tender working for a potential commercial benefit. When you're talking with a patient themselves that has been through the rigmarole, that has tested a lot of products and found something that worked for them, oftentimes that creates a sense of community that continues to build for years into the future.
When you're looking at your business model to be a licensed grower, do you have some idea of on what scale, everything else being equal, with all of the permits in place and all of your business partners lined up, on what kind of quantity 5 years out?
Yeah, so we will be at 9,000 kilos by the end of 20 2019, and we have at least earmarked for several acres more after that. So our capacity could be 50,000 plus kilograms.
And Chris alluded to this, and it's part of the discussion about whether or not you're going to have the conventional method of distribution of cannabis products now, i.e. illegally through dealers, not talking about dispensaries. I'm talking about the recreational market as we know it. That if the price point doesn't match up with what you grow and made available through Chris or somebody else, you end up with the same system staying.
Yeah, under the status quo right now, the average price is $9.62, and the street value is anywhere between $9 and $11. So it's going to be there. The question is what will the tax do to that? In the sense of you have to. So the price point is going to have to stay in there, and there's going to be premium and there's going to be discount, but that's going to be the price point is somewhere in between those.
Will there still be a black market?
Of course. Of course there will.
Serving whom?
Just in the same way that there is a black market for cigarettes and there's a black market for alcohol, and there will always be, it's not going to be eliminated entirely. But I think what will, and certainly what I would say is that everybody that is new coming into the system, so the 4.5 million people that will be coming in, all of those individuals will be coming into the regulated system, and there'll be people that come over, and there will be people that don't.
So is it price point that will continue to drive a black market, or is it access?
No, it's preference, and it could be access. I mean, and one of the things too, just that is really important from the online platform, because the same day delivery. I mean, part of the issue in Nova Scotia is you can't have same-day delivery because there's no producers here, right? I mean, that's not possible, and so that is a legitimate access question, that is raised, and so one of the things that we also think from an infrastructure point of view is that it's really important to maintain that model, and that distribution is certainly well within that regime right now.
All right.
I agree with Myrna's point on the price point. It does seem to be about $9 or $10 a gram that things are flowing in average, but at the pharmacist, we sell our cannabis products at $5 to $6 a gram, which is much lower than most dispensaries across the country. And I think that when we move away from prohibition, you'll see more individuals willing to work in a philanthropic effort and try to drive these prices down. Because the only thing that keeps prices at that $9 to $10 a gram price point is pure greed.
And when you see more people growing their own, if you have 4 plants, and if you can get good seeds, if you can get ways to grow your own, that'll also have a downward effect.
Absolutely, and that'll have the biggest downward effect.
Deborah Snow, who's with us in the audience, has a question. Go ahead, Deb.
Just wondering what's going to happen to people living in financial poverty, being able to access their medical marijuana. Personally, I'm a breast cancer patient for Capital Health for the past 15 years as their research, and this is the 3rd time that I'm going through breast cancer. The only medicine I'm using right now is the cannabis oil, and it's provided to me by the Compassionate Club, where there's no charge to me because I'm living on welfare and I don't have enough money to live on, let alone pay for my cannabis medicine. And I refuse to use pharmaceuticals after going through chemotherapy and radiation and homelessness and poverty. And I think as research patients, I think it's time for our breast cancer patients to stand up and have a voice, because I know the benefits of this medicine. All cannabis is plant medicine, okay? There is no distinction between recreational or medicinal. It's a plant from God, okay? And this plant is medicine for all people to heal our human bodies. We all have an endocannabinoid system. That's the way God made us. And this plant is to heal the bodies. So what's going to happen to cancer patients like me when we try to get rid of our dispensaries, like, the mom and pop stores, right? It's the same as they did with the big Walmarts and everything else. Get rid of the little people and just bring in those licensed producers so that they can have all access to everybody and their finances. I went to a licensed producer a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted $400 for my medicine. I told them I only live on less than $300 a month. I said, that would take my food money. What do you want me to do? So I asked them if they had a Compassionate Club to provide my medicine at no charge. They offered me 15% off the $400 bill. How shameful is that? And I think our Capital Health system better take care of their breast cancer patients better than they've taken care of me.
All right, Ms. Snow, thank you very much for that question. Who would like to take that one on, Myrna?
So one of the things I do know is that pharmacare and senior pharmacare, so if you're on social assistance or lower income, there was a court challenge a number of years ago, and it was actually Justice Chipman allowed for it, and it was overturned at the Court of Appeal. But the reason it was not allowed, and I think that this is an important distinction, is because the supply was not through the regulated market. And so they said for social sort of policy reasons that they couldn't endorse the supply chain, essentially, is what it was. So I think if I look at the evolution of where the insurance cases are going, that is one area where I think that there is an opening for some consideration of access for individuals on social assistance if you're doing it through the legal supply chain. So that may be an opportunity there. And I think the other thing is that outside of compassionate pricing, which I appreciate your point that it's not adequate for your circumstances, there's also growing. So you can grow your own medicine, and that's at very low cost, or you can have someone else do it for you. So those are at least, you know, some of the path to that solution. It's not the solution, but it's a start.
There's a broader issue here as well. It's a great point, but it's a broader issue of how we deal with poverty in a country that is supposed to have a universal healthcare system. And so it's a bigger issue than cannabis. It's about making sure that people have access to what they need in order to stay healthy or regain their health. And so whether it's cannabis or some other medication, I think having the legitimate supply chain and regulated substances, the same as with other medications, and then having the insurance, the public insurance and private insurance policies actually cover this stuff makes sense. It's morally right for us to be addressing poverty issues and creating equity, not equality, equity in our society when it comes to poverty.
And even the CBC this morning, there was a story on about universal medical coverage, like so for drugs, and that it's actually more cost effective. The studies in other countries that do that. Sure. So you know maybe this will be part of the larger discussion. Who knows?
And if Justice Minister Furey is listening, I want to make sure he understands that there's really only 3 options on the table. He can onboard dispensaries like us into the new regime. He can put us behind bars, cold, hard steel, and shut us down that way. Or we can just continue to operate status quo as we've been doing for the past 5 years, which I expect is what's going to happen. We'll be there for you, Deb. Don't worry.
Thank you, Chris. God bless your
Can't it also, isn't there a 4th option, though? And I'm asking.
And I'm listening. My ears are open if there is one.
I'm asking. I'm not, but isn't there a 4th option where it becomes handled the same as all other prescribed medications so that it goes through pharmacy chains, not separate dispensaries?
I don't know any medical patient that purchases cannabis from my store that doesn't want to be able to see and smell their medicine before they purchase it. So much of the value of cannabis as a medicine comes from the terpenes, which work synergistically with the cannabinoids to provide that benefit. Until you've had a chance to really smell the flower itself, you don't always know what cannabis flower is going to work for you, and oftentimes those terpenes give you a hint that this is going to be where I should spend my money this week because I think this strain is going to work for me, and it helps.
There's a side effect of that, though, we might want to consider a societal side effect, and that is we talk about stigma, which really, it's just a new, sexier word for prejudice, but you know, we've decided to use that. But we have stigma around really all substance use, and cannabis certainly is part of that. And the more we keep it for the medical strains, the medical distribution, the more we keep that as a separate thing from other medicines, the more we actually will sustain that stigma, instead of eliminating it by normalizing medical use of a medicine. And so if it's integrated into the current system the same as all other medications, then it's normal to go to your pharmacy to pick up your medication, no matter what it is. And we start to, you know, the cannabis users for medical purposes start to look normal to everybody instead of looking like something different. And
if you can imagine 30 strains of cannabis on display at your pharmacy and the chance to smell and touch each one, then I am totally in favor of that system as well, absolutely.
Well, I think it's possible.
As a disclaimer, I'm not practicing and haven't been for a long time, so I can't weigh in on that one.
But we have an appropriate question which came from Kerry Kelly, who was watching this discussion on Facebook. How do we know the dispensaries carry safe cannabis? Which we'll give you a pass on that one. We'll assume that's okay. But where does it come from? Where do you get your cannabis?
So we try to source our cannabis specifically from designated growers, literally from coast to coast. As much as possible here in Nova Scotia, growers that are licensed to grow for either themselves or for two growers, for two other patients under the ACMPR or under licenses extended by the MMAR injunction that happened through the Allard decision. Those growers, despite the fact that they are limited in their plant numbers and their storage limits, oftentimes when they harvest their crop, they have more weight than they're allowed to put into storage or than their patient needs. The federal government's position is that that product should be milled with cat litter and put out to the garbage. But if that product is safe for two patients that the federal government has authorized that grower to grow for, then why isn't that product also safe for other medically licensed patients who are struggling to access cannabis right now? And so there are tens of thousands of growers from coast to coast who are part of this program. And as prohibition falls and as the market opens up, more and more of those growers are willing to explore coming to dispensaries, talking to dispensaries, and even some of them forming co-ops in order to bring their product to dispensaries in a safe and regulated way.
Are they at risk driving from Antigonish to your dispensary?
Yeah, quite frankly, you know, I used to have to source my product by driving to other parts of the country quite remotely, and my heart would be in a race and my adrenaline pumping for 3 days straight as I brought that product back to our patients here in Nova Scotia. Thank goodness we no longer have to do that, and by developing a dispensary and encouraging more and more growers here in Nova Scotia, we're able to supply a large part of our product from here, and I expect that to continue more moving forward.
All right, another question from Dave Cuderion. I believe I have the pronunciation right there, Dave. Apologies if not. This is again from Facebook as well. How much revenue do you think this will generate for Nova Scotia? Will the province just break even as it's predicting? Myrna, do you want to try that?
It depends on what the infrastructure looks like. So, I mean, I think if the province, for example, there are already existing online platforms, and so if they just said, we'll put the tax on, and we have distributors across the country doing that, that would be very cost neutral. It's not going to cost much at all. If it's bricks and mortar and staffing, then, you know, that could have some real cost, you know, sort of barriers. I mean, now what the Liquor Commission would tell you is that, you know, they generated $656 million in sales last year, about 20% of which was profit. So I don't know, you know, if it will trend in the same way it does in those sales. But you know, certainly there's two views out there that it may not be cost neutral. It may actually cost more, and some people are of the view that this is going to be a huge profit. So I suspect it's somewhere in the middle.
Is it wrong to think of it as a possible profit maker when you're talking about all the things that cannabis might be able to do to help people? Or
well, I mean, I think that, you know, profit is simply, you know, that your net gain exceeds your expenses, and so that's what it's defined as. It's what you use that money for is what matters. And so, you know, certainly from the federal perspective, you know, the messaging has been that it's cost neutral and that anything that's, you know, it will be either put into public health or put into education and you know, will be spent in that way. I mean, I don't know what will actually happen with it, but, you know, there's certainly, the potential is there for... Do
you think we'll see a lot of marketing?
No, there won't be marketing because it's restricted. It's just like tobacco. So it's very, you know, and I don't anticipate seeing any changes in C45 on that.
Okay, very good, sir.
I think it's, to answer your question specifically, I think it's wrong to design our regulatory system to increase profit for government or others, or the companies themselves, because that is the antithesis of a public health model that is designed first for protection, first to legalize, to allow people to use legally, but with the caveat that the first priority is protection, and whatever profit comes for people after that is fine. But when I think about the NSLC and its profits, the concept of profit for our government in Nova Scotia is actually a non-existent concept. So, and what governments tend to focus on in regard to this substance, to alcohol, is actually revenue. It's about cash flow for spending purposes, because it isn't profitable. Alcohol is a losing battle. We're spending far more than twice the costs through health and justice and absenteeism and all those things on alcohol than we're bringing in actual profit. And so I think you know, the discussion is more about revenue and cash flow that you can use during your elected term. And let's not talk about what the damage might be. And you know, in this case, we have to be careful to not think of that concept of profit first, but first designed for the purpose that Trudeau said, which was we're going to legalize for the purpose of getting it out of the hands of our young people. And if we don't make that the #1 priority, we are failing. He is failing. And the fact that he's deferred so many of the decisions, the important ones like age, to the provinces is quite frankly, I think, the biggest violation of his campaign that I can foresee.
Maybe one last comment from all of you, maybe a subject we did not touch on or none of our listeners or viewers touched on that you might want to make a point, either directly or indirectly to Mr. Furey and the government, or just some topic that to the broader subject that we may not have touched. We haven't heard from you in a while, Nadine.
What I'd like to say is I think it's really important to have that communication, the dialogue, to educate, as I said before at the very beginning, to educate yourself, but to make sure that you're being transparent about how you're approaching this in the workplace so people don't think it's a witch hunt for people who are using cannabis, but it's about health and safety. Find out what's best practices in your industry and/or collectively, and follow through and continue that communication. And make sure that you're being consistent with respecting people's rights and privacy, but you're also safeguarding, first and foremost, safety. That's what this is all about.
Myrna?
So I think that, the idea of, this groundswell it may not be as dramatic as some people are expecting. I also think that it is a really wonderful opportunity on the medical side for us to have this dialogue and have all of these conversations. And you talk about, public policy to really advance, the positives, and also to be reflective of the things that are concerning, and to do the best that we can from a public policy point of view to allow access, but that also is and I take your point on the buzzword of responsible consumption, but people will consume, and so it's making sure that they do so in a way that is best, in totality. So I think that this is actually a really positive thing medically, and the recreational side, I think it's just an evolution of what is already here.
Chris?
My comment is a plea to Nova Scotians that you don't wait, that you plant your seeds today. We'll help you get licensed. If you want to get medically authorized, come talk to us. But you need to start forming your relationship with the cannabis plant today. And you need to have that cannabis available in your hands so that when your neighbor or your family member gets sick, that they're not looking to the government for access, that they're not looking to a dispensary that might be getting raided for access, but they can turn to their friends and family who they know the benefit of cannabis and have the supply available to them. And I think in Nova Scotia we have a unique opportunity to build a culture from the grassroots up that keeps the price of cannabis at a minimum, that keeps the quality of cannabis at a maximum, and keeps profits out of the industry.
Mr. Leader.
A couple things. I guess one, I would say to Minister Furey and Minister Delory and others who will be part of these discussions. One is make sure that the decisions that get made at the provincial level are consistent with the promise that was made by their party at the federal level, and which is a public health model and not a commercialized model. And number two, ignore the internet survey that you've done, because it allowed for anybody to complete that survey as many times as they wanted to, which means that where there's profit incentive, that it is quite possible that there will be skewed results that are simply not representative in any way of the public opinion.
All right, I think that pretty much wraps things up. I'm sure there may be a few conversations that we'll carry on the floor here afterwards, but our thanks to the panelists for joining us. It's been very insightful tonight, so we do appreciate that. Our thanks to our live audience here as well with your pertinent questions, to Don Connolly for his journalistic expertise here as well on this, and to you as well for all of the great questions that you brought to us from online. So thank you very much for watching, and good night.
Oh.
Awesome.